Welcome to North Shore Conversations. I'm Laura Swanson, your host. This podcast series is being brought to you by the North Shore Alliance for Economic Development. The Alliance is a private-public membership organization made up of regional leaders who focus on the economic development of the North Shore region, addressing issues such as transportation, housing, workforce, and the retention and recruitment of businesses to the region. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about housing and what does that mean in terms of challenges and opportunities for the North Shore. So I'd like to welcome Salem Mayor Dominic Pangallo, and I'd like to welcome Mike Wheeler, who is the President and Chief Operating Officer of North Shore Bank. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
Let's just jump into it. Let's just talk about housing. From your perspective, how has the housing shortage impacted your community, our region, and business growth and operations? Mayor, how about if we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I think that's a great question. There is a direct and tangible connection between our housing challenges and the strength of our local economy. In Salem, especially, our economy is so dependent on the diversity of our population. So people are the crux of your economy, like in Salem, whether it's our visitor economy or higher education, healthcare, any of our major economic sectors. If they can't afford to live locally, or they can't find the kinds of housing that meets their needs, they're forced to leave. And that puts a strain on, we already have a challenging labor market here, the negative impact it has on the character of our community. It's a major challenge for us. And I think that, as we're looking at the kind of diversity of housing that we have here, it's not necessarily matching with the kind of workforce that we need to have. So there's some real work to be done. There's great progress that's been made so far, but we're at a place where it's a supply and demand issue. Salem's a place where people want to live, so demand is strong. But when the supply doesn't match that, it just causes prices and rents to escalate further. We don't want to reduce demand. That means making Salem a less desirable place to live and a less desirable place for people to come to. So we need to think instead about how we address the supply side of the equation.
Mike, from your perspective, what are you thinking?
I think I echo the mayor's sentiments pretty much along the line of, for a business, everybody can't make the top salary in a business. That's why housing has to be diversified. There's affordable housing, there's workforce housing, there's rentals. It is very difficult for an organization to continue to grow when the workforce that's needed for that growth can't live in the general area. We've had individuals who moved to New Hampshire because they can't afford to live in the eastern part of Massachusetts. And that's primarily where our business is. In matching the type of workforce we need to the type of housing is significant. Everybody wants to be independent. They don't want to live with their parents when they, after college. They want to go out on their own. They want to migrate to a community. And if you can't afford to live in that community, and regardless of how ideological it is, you tend to move away. And when the cost of commuting becomes extensive, which it has over the past several years, people tend to give notice and move to those areas. So we've lost 3 employees who were living in New Hampshire, and they just couldn't afford to live in Massachusetts. They moved from Massachusetts when they graduated from college to New Hampshire. They worked with us, but because the cost of commuting and transportation is so high, they have left the bank and gone to work for a bank locally in their in where they live, and that's definitely a problem. And it makes businesses really sit down and wonder if growth in this region is the right thing to do. How do you diversify that? And more importantly, how do you move away from relying on FTEs to grow the business and focusing more on technology, because you can't get the FTEs necessary to grow your business? And it's a conundrum. And I think it's something that we have made strides, especially definitely in the affordable housing areas arena, specifically in this part of Massachusetts. But I think overall we need to look, in addition to affordable housing and keep doing a great job in doing what we do there, we need to look at different ways of ensuring that our workforce can live in the communities in which they work. And it makes a better community all around.
Mayor, could you talk a little bit more about the different kinds of housing for those listeners that may not necessarily be aware of the terminology, what it means, and who they're trying to serve in those pockets of housing development?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, affordable housing is an initiative that the state is focused on, which focuses on both local funding, state funding, and federal funding. And it gives the opportunity for a very diverse community. People who are at a certain level of average median income qualify for each one of these affordable housing units. So that integration of economic differences can really be filled. Um, then you get workforce housing. This is just the people that we need to um, work for landscaping companies, work for restaurants, work for banks. These are the individuals who may not be at the highest levels of in the economic environment, but still need a place to live, need a place to prosper. Um, tentatively, it's usually people who have income between 75,000 and 150,000. Those are the numbers that, and workforce housing is not an official definition. It is one that's becoming a little bit more momentum because we are seeing a lot of people leave our area, and that's household income between that 75 and $150,000. And I think those are the two major. Right? I mean, once you get to the higher earning levels, you tend to have more opportunities, whether it's a rental, whether it's purchasing a home. Um, and there tends to be more inventory at that level.
Mayor Pangallo, I'm wondering if you could give our listeners some examples of what Salem has done specifically in the housing arena.
Yeah, I mean, housing has been a major priority for both the last administration and for this administration. I think that we recognize that it's changing the character of our community. It's causing people to, ironically, have to drive more. As Mike said, we see about 17,000 people a day commute into Salem to work. And if a fraction of those people could find a place closer to where they work, they wouldn't be on those entrance corridors, adding to traffic congestions and emissions problems and our impacts to the climate crisis. Or it's further made more challenging by the fact that we're in the greater Boston area. So when we say area and median income, it's actually not even, it's almost double for the area, but it is in Salem where our local median income is half of that. So it's become more and more of a challenge. Our agenda over the last administration with Mayor Driscoll, now Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, and into this administration has been very focused on trying to identify solutions to right size our housing supply. We have over 600 affordable housing units were created since 2010 here in Salem. 100 of those were deed restricted affordable units created by private sector partners. Following the city has an inclusionary housing policy that we're hoping will be codified as an ordinance in the near future. But almost 500 units are created by nonprofit partners who are successful thanks to the city's efforts supporting them in search of their acquisitions of funding, contributions from our own Community Preservation Act and our home funds. We've also put a lot of effort into housing stability. There's a lot of talk about housing as a zoning or a building thing, but it's really also a people challenge too. So we've invested pretty substantially through our ARPA funds in trying to build up efforts to help people make ends meet. So rental assistance, first time and first generation home buyer assistance. We have a new neighborhood stability coordinator that's working on eviction diversion counseling. And we have a housing stability service program that's in partnership with the Essex County Bar Association. So we avoid displacement by trying to help people stay in their homes, keep a little bit more money in their pocket. And to that end, we're also, working on initiatives to try to slow the conversion of our rental stock and make sure that we're preserving that as affordable, naturally occurring affordable rental units. So some of that's through a condo conversion regulations to slow down this pace at which apartments are converted to condominiums. And some of that's through a program that we launched trying to use some of our ARPA dollars to acquire right of first refusal from multifamily property owners. So if they do decide to sell down the road, the city might be able to get a foot in the door and say, let's slow down a little, talk to some of our private sector partners, some of our nonprofit partners, and see if we can try to acquire this and maintain it as permanent affordable rental stock, because that's the kind of housing, over 50% of Salem's residents are renters, and it's the kind of housing that we really need here for our workforce.
To add on to what the mayor is saying, he's absolutely right. It's got to be a cooperative environment amongst the private sector, municipalities, and financing agencies, whether it's public financing, private financing, to get a community that's thriving. And I think that's the point of the statement I made previously.
So we've talked about the different types of housing. We've talked about sort of opportunities around that. Can we now talk a little bit about the barriers? Like, what are they, and why are they? Mayor, wondering if you might be able to shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think some of the barriers, like the cost of construction, is not insignificant. The cost of land, inflationary impacts, materials, labor, all of that. A lot of the land in Salem, we're 8 square miles and pretty well built up already. And if you're looking to do new building here, a lot of this has some degree of contamination from previous industrial uses. That just makes projects even more costly. And we've looked at ways to address these challenges with some of the tools that we have. Mike mentioned some of those public-private financing partnerships. We have a program, the HDIP Housing Incentive Program, that provides basically a TIF structure for market rate housing and the use of ARPA funds to help encourage the growth of housing and bring those costs down. We reformed the city's surplus ordinance so that when we surplus land, instead of just thinking about profit, we can also think about other policy goals like housing, for example. And we're changing our zoning to allow for vacant church and school buildings to be allowed, because it's really about maximizing the ability to use those assets that we have to drive down the cost of creating new housing. And I think the other part of it is, there are regulatory challenges that can impede the growth of housing and projects in general. So we want to ensure that growth happens in a way that's responsible and well managed and structured to our community's needs and to our values here. But often the process can be excessively dragged out through permitting appeals, fights over zoning. So it's really about finding that balance. There's projects that are starting to construct right now here in Salem that they have been over a decade and going through the process. And not all of that is because of appeals. Some of that is just on the development community as well. But some of these projects take an exceptionally long time. Such some of the barriers to kind of meeting the housing supply needs that we have here in the community.
I agree with the mayor 100%. I mean, everything he said are the challenges. I do think those challenges are going to get more complicated in the future. Supply and demand is definitely a big issue. Most developers are for profit, with the exception of some of the CDCs, and kind of navigating through the permitting process, navigating through the environmental process. To the mayor's point earlier, a lot of the North Shore was used for industrial, especially, in PBD, Salem, portions of Beverly. And that has, in today's environment, has created a challenge from an environmental standpoint, a cost in cleaning up whatever it is that the sins of our past are catching up to meet the requirements of today's laws. And again, I think the Commonwealth has done a good job with different programs to mitigate that. I think communities who really believe in housing initiatives have done a really good job in understanding. In developers haven't had to use the forced 40B program, which is an affordable housing program. The communities that have been successful, and again, I think the previous administration and I'm sure the mayor's administration going forward is going to continue to look for different possibilities to make that possible. So it's a win-win on both sides. It's a win for this. It's a win-win-win. It's a win for the city. It's a win for the prospective owners and renters, and it's a win for the developers that do that. And that's the only way you're going to get a successful program in housing.
I'm just curious, your thoughts on how are different generations impacted by the current housing condition that we have?
I will tell you, I had a conversation recently with my daughter, who's 21, and she would love to move out with some friends, and she can't. And she works a regular job, and it's the cost of housing has basically pushed her out of this community. This is a community she grew up in. She spent her entire childhood life living in Beverly, and she can't afford comfortably. Now, when I say afford comfortably, this is being able to go out to dinner, being able to own a car, and not specifically spending your entire earnings for paying rent or a mortgage. And generations, especially that Y generation, I don't know, the generations for that, are really focused on lifestyles and life needs versus maybe the greatest generation, the baby boomers and the X, were focused on a very different environment. And I think that's where you kind of butt heads in housing. One group will do anything they can to buy a house, and if that means giving up going out to eat, that's fine. The other group says, "Yeah, I'm not so much interested in that. I can live in my parents' basement if I have to, or I can go to a different community, and I can get all that I want." And again, the problem with that is the economic disassociation that goes along with that type of environment. it creates a lack of employees. It ultimately will affect the economy of those areas who aren't successful, or you won't have an economy. If you take a look at some of the more affluent suburbs who don't have that diverse housing mix, they don't rely on the economic environment to survive, but they don't have much of a main street. They don't have much of a downtown or a desire to bring industry to the outskirts to those areas. And I think that's part of the issue. And again, that's where that 40B program comes in to help to bring some of that housing in, and it forces communities to take into consideration the diversification of the economic levels of individuals. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I can expand on that for here in Salem. We have a situation where we're like a millennial peak community, one of 20 in the Commonwealth. We have a third of our residents are between 18 and 34, which is not common for many cities and towns. And they have a very, I think, unique set of challenges in this economy right now. And a lot of those people are also the ones that work those critical frontline jobs that I mentioned before that just can't afford to make rent at what those jobs pay for salary in terms of, the cost of living here in Salem. And they're also facing the challenge of not having the types of housing that they need. So just to give you an example, in Salem, we have about almost 75% of our households are one or two people, but 25% of our housing supply is one bedroom or studio. So we don't have the housing mix. So those people that want to find housing here are forced to either be overburdened with a house that's too large for them, or they just can't afford a place at all. And it's not only more expensive for rent and mortgage, but it's more expensive for your month-to-month costs, utility costs, all of that. And on the other side of the equation, even though the younger adults are our largest population, our fastest growing population are those 65 and older, increased by about 25% in the last decade. And they have very needs. They may also need those one or two bedrooms as they downsize, but they're looking for universal design, single floor living, place where they might have the ability to walk or get to the amenities and services they want as well. So how we're creating the new housing that is created here, how it's meeting those needs, as those older adults downsize or choose to move into an accessory dwelling unit in their home and open up their home to a growing family, there's a need for affordable home ownership opportunities for families. But right now, like the pinch point we're seeing in Salem is, the housing supply we have doesn't match up with the kind of household mix that we're seeing both at the older adult end and also the younger adult demographic.
Mayor Pangallo, I'm just wondering, just in follow-up, can you give us some examples of successful housing initiatives, either in Salem or across the Commonwealth?
I think in Salem we've had strong success. I mentioned those 600 affordable units, and we've made far more housing progress in the housing supply front. There's those 600. That's just the affordable component in the last decade. We've had some projects that I think that people look at them and they think they're really good examples of design. They fit well with the neighborhood. Projects like a Halstead Station, even bricks in our downtown neighborhood, opportunities to kind of utilize these former vacant sites, whether they're former courthouses or former industrial sites and factories, and turn them into housing. We're really turning the dial up in the projects that are about to come in terms of trying to push for greater affordability, steeper affordability, and a greater share of units in what's coming down the pike. Fully cognizant of the fact that you need to have that mix. Like Mike said, you need to have a balance that, it can't all be affordable because in a hot place like Salem, if it is, people of means are going to just come in and displace people who have lower incomes. So you need to have market rate housing as well as that affordability component. So that's the kind of projects that we've really pushed for here in Salem in partnership with the private development community and also our nonprofit sector partners like the CDC and Harbor Light. And I think that's really the path to kind of successful projects in the future.
Speaking through, just talking a little bit more about workforce and impact. You're both employers, right? And I'm just wondering what you're seeing in terms of, Mike, you touched on this a little bit earlier, in terms of the housing needs affecting your ability to recruit and retain your workforce. Mayor, I think we're talking to you as the mayor of the city of Salem, but you're also an employer, right? So what are you seeing in terms of the challenges in the recruitment and retention of workforce, whether it be in the community or Mike, in the community of Salem, or Mike, the communities where your banks are located?
for us, we've had a hard time getting the entry level positions filled because it's really expensive to live around here. And again, we have a lot of people that commute to work more than I don't quote me on the numbers that commute more than 30 miles a day because it's cheaper to live outside of Eastern Massachusetts. And that is fine when gas is $1.99 a gallon for entry level workers, but as soon as you get transportation costs that you know uh, exceed the gas price or just the purchasing of vehicles. It's become very expensive to purchase a vehicle to get to work. People have to make decisions as to the quality of life that they want and the lifestyle that they want to have. And it's definitely, it's a struggle to fill those positions. And we have 22 open positions in just for tellers. That traditional model of, moms or the significant other whose significant other operates a business and they work at the bank, so they have insurance. That model doesn't exist a lot anymore. And I think if we had a better opportunity to create an environment, and Salem is a wonderful place to live, right? You have that downtown, it's vibrant, there's a lot going on. I can't think of anybody under the age of 35 who wouldn't want to live in downtown Salem. The issue is how it's expensive to live in downtown Salem when you go outside of those affordable housing environments because people with means have the capacity to do it, and developers have built expensive projects. And I think that's the balance that I was talking about earlier. And it's not just Salem; it's Beverly, it's uh, Peabody. All the communities are struggling with the same thing because you have to attract a developer to come in and build something. They have to have a success on the other side from a profitability standpoint or from a cash flow perspective. So everything can't be affordable. Everything can't be workforce. But that balance, we built the community that people want to live in. Now we just need to figure out how to balance that out so we can get people of diversity, people of different economic means to live in our communities. And that's what will make the community continue to thrive and be great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, like, even the city of Salem as an employer ourselves, we struggle to retain employees because they can't afford to live here, whether it's in our municipal departments or our schools. It, if they're living outside of our city a certain distance, they're forced to endure a pretty miserable commute. And we don't have the benefit in most of the kinds of jobs that we offer as a city of remote work. You can't, remote work if you're a teacher or if you're working in the collector's office or if you're in the parking department or you're a police officer. So you have to be here. If you're at DPW, you have to be here. And that makes it hard because we're asking people to have to either commute or be able to afford to live here. So it's affected our ability to retain folks or to hire on board. Like the impact, the cost to a business, as Mike would know, or even just the impacts to service delivery of having to constantly cycle through onboarding new people as you fill positions because somebody else took a job closer to home or that, it gave them the ability to work from home. That's tough. It's tough for our business community. And it's also, a real challenge in a place like Salem where our tourism facing businesses account for a quarter of our jobs here in Salem. But the average wages in that sector barely make what the market rent is for you're basically paying the entirety of your paycheck for rent if you're working in that industry. So people are either forced to move out of the community or they're doubling up with others or they're just getting by and paying way too much of their monthly take home pay to cover their rent payments. So it's a challenge for our workforce as an employer, the city, and it's also a challenge to our economy and the workforce that we rely on to make Salem so vibrant and special.
And from your perspective, how is the housing, the transportation, and the workforce challenge, how are they all interconnected? Because you sort of spoken about them in sort of giving different examples. And I think the time of just talking about these issues in silos, I think, are sort of behind us because they really are so interconnected. And for people who don't live in this space on a daily basis like all of us, what is it that you want them to know about that interconnection of the issues of transportation and housing and the workforce needs and opportunities?
Like I said before, if your workforce can't find a place to live near where they work, you either lose your workforce or it worsens your traffic congestion. It's deeply interconnected. We have to think about how we shape development patterns into the future. The idea of the kind of spread out single family home neighborhoods. It's not really the model that's going to work in Salem anymore. We don't have the land for it. But also, if we want to encourage people to be able to live near where they work or live near public transit, that means that we're looking at housing that is a little bit more conspicuous than it was in the past, a little bit more dense, maybe. There were fewer new housing units created in Salem in the last decade than the average decade of the 20th century. The difference is that in the last decade, the housing we've built here is very conspicuous, so people see it, right? It's multifamily housing, it's larger buildings downtown, so it's kind of in your face as opposed to tucked away in a neighborhood somewhere. But that kind of housing is the housing that makes it easier to bring people in, to keep employees, to strengthen our economy, to create a downtown customer base for the businesses we want here year round, not just the tourism facing businesses. So it's central to our economy as well. So it's connected: transportation, housing, and the kind of economy that we want to have in Salem like here. And it's also a regional issue. As communities around the North Shore become more costly for residents, it just further displaces people outside of our regional economy as well. So Salem's going to keep being a leader in this space. We want to ensure an affordable North Shore for everybody. And I'm hopeful and confident that our partners in the communities around the North Shore feel the same way as well.
Brings me back to the 40s and the 50s, where large companies used to come in and they used to build their houses for the workforce. So they kept everybody interconnected. So people didn't have to use transportation, because back then 1 car per family was a privilege. Over the years, when more companies have come in and communities have become more distributed, the housing, transportation, and workforce, where that topic was very centralized and controlled by certain entities, has become less controlled by any entity, and now is being controlled through regulation, through cost, and desire to be in an environment. They are interconnected to the extent that it can make or break a community in the long run. Short term, everything happens short term. If the communities do well, they evolve and they figure out how to deal with it. But housing, transportation, and workforce, you can't have one without the other these days. You're not getting, the shoe's not coming in and building 600 houses for its employees, so they don't have to drive to work. They can walk to work. That environment doesn't exist anymore. So we continue to have to evolve in housing. And in the transportation, we don't, the mayor hit it right on the nose. We don't want congestion in our communities. Congestion in our communities just forces other people out of the communities. What we want is we want a integrated housing economic environment that the workforce can be comfortable in. And again, I think our communities, specifically in the North Shore, are doing a really good job talking about it, acting on it. But you know what? Everything is limited by how much funding we can get, whether it's from the federal government, whether it's from the Commonwealth, or the municipalities. Right? It is finite. There are limitations to it, and so we have to be smart in how we think through the process, how we invest our money, and how do we attract the diverse populations that we want.
And from your perspective, each of you, what role do you see the Alliance playing in this particular space? As you know, the Alliance focuses really on transportation, workforce, the housing, and business recruitment and retention.
I think the Alliance is an important voice for each one of those topics. It's a connector. It's a red flag raiser. It brings topics to the forefront. It's allowing community leaders, allowing state leaders and politicians to kind of understand the issues that are facing our environment. It's selfish, right? It's really focusing on us. We want to be able to raise those red flags to say, hey, look, here's what our issues are. This is what we need. Let me bring the issues to the forefront, and let's try to continue to focus and advocate for fixing these issues, whether it's a train stop in Salem, whether it's housing, or try to figure out what happened to our workforce. Where did they all go? Pre-pandemic, I've been doing this for a long time, and I can't remember a stress in the workforce as much as I've seen a stress in the workforce that we've seen over the last 24 months. And I think that's how it's all interconnected in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the that the Alliance provides an essential role as a convener, communicator. The work that you do in space related to economic development or workforce development is essential because, as we've talked about here today, it is directly tied to housing, and housing is tied directly to it. It's not just about housing as a job creator because of the jobs it creates for the people building the housing, but it's also about the connections that makes for the people that that work in the businesses and the institutions and the cities that make the North Shore special. I think that regional approach is the other beneficial aspect of what the Alliance brings to the table here, which is it's not constrained to thinking about just one community or one silo. It's really multidisciplinary and multi municipality based. So we value that greatly.
I'd like to thank our guest, Salem Mayor Dominic Pangallo, Mike Wheeler, President and Chief Operating Officer of North Shore Bank, for participating in this conversation on housing. It's a very important issue, and thank you both for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.